today at this very early hour. This lecture is organized by the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Global Japanese Studies Model Unit. And I also like to give a special shout out to Professor Fuyuki, who is the main organizer of this lecture, and Mr. Shinohara Kikishi there, who has been a great help in putting all this together. And I'm Tetsumo Teyama of the School of Law. Although today's lecture is about Hamlet and ontology, it's wonderful to have at least some of you here physically present, making it unnecessary to ask who's there, as Bernardo does at the beginning of Hamlet, and as many of us have been doing during online classes. It's also very exciting to be able to introduce to you in person Dr. Jessica Chiba, who is a Lieberholm Research Fellow at the Shakespeare Institute in the UK. The Shakespeare Institute and Waseda have been engaged in a research collaboration since 2017, and Dr. Chiba has very kindly agreed to speak today as part of this collaboration. Before moving to the Shakespeare Institute last year, Dr. Chiba was a teaching fellow at Royal Holloway, and but she also has personal ties to Waseda, as I've discovered that most of her relatives from one side of her family are Waseda alumni. Dr. Chiba's research has been focused on exploring philosophical issues in Shakespeare. She is currently getting ready to publish a monograph titled Shakespeare and Ontology, and is working on her next book titled Shakespeare's Untranslatability. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Jessica Chiba.
I would first like to express my deep gratitude to everyone who made this possible. So to Professor Fuyuki and to Professor Motoyama, and a warm welcome to everyone who's turned up at such a ridiculously early hour of the morning, and to everyone who's tuning in on Zoom. As Professor Motoyama has said, this is a continuation of our collaboration between Waseda and Birmingham, and it's a great honor to be part of this collaboration. So without much further ado, I would like to just say that my lecture will touch on a lot of different things and some philosophy, as you might have been warned. And don't worry if it's a little bit dense at times. I'll try to make this as comprehensive as possible. So I think my main subject is translation. And there are many ways of thinking and talking about translation, especially Shakespeare translation. And this is true partly because Shakespeare is one of the most translated authors in the world. So he becomes a kind of figure that many people turn to in order to look at this idea of translation. In Japan, translation is necessarily a major area of study for Shakespeare because most non-Anglophone readers first encounter foreign authors in translation. A scholar of Shakespeare translation has many different ways of approaching this subject. You can choose to focus on one translator or lots of different translations of the same work, or you can look at translations produced at a particular time. So the focus can be on the text itself. For instance, you could look at a study of prosody, looking at rhythm, word choice, rhyme. Or you could look at the broader social context of the translation itself. So for instance, you could focus on the influence of early democratic movements on the translations of somebody like Tsubo Chiyoyo, or the fact that his first translated work is Julius Caesar. Or if you were looking at Odashima's translations, you could be looking at the effect of Westernization and the Shogekijo movement on his translations. But I think it's safe to say that in most cases, studies of translation, Shakespeare translation, focus on the translations themselves as the main purpose of the study. The English source, written by Shakespeare, can be brought in for comparison, but it's of secondary concern to translation studies. And though my focus is on Japanese specifically, the same can be said of most studies of translation in different languages. Translation is interesting to Shakespeare scholars insofar as it illustrates Shakespeare's afterlives, the ways in which Shakespeare has been used by others, and the way that his work has traveled the world. My concern on a general level is whether or not the study of translation could be less one-directional. So instead of seeing Shakespeare as the source and translation as one of the ends to which his works have been put, I'm interested to see whether translation might not speak back, as it were, and be a way of reading Shakespeare, a way of deepening our engagement with the source text. So my question is, what can translation teach us about Shakespeare, and why does it matter? And I've started with this long blurb because I've been considering how to talk about my specialism, and that's untranslatability. As I've already said, my desire is to see what translation might reveal about Shakespeare's work. And I think the best way of doing that is actually to look at Shakespeare's work through what can't be translated. As well as being intercultural, this subject is philosophical because the question is about how we express ourselves, how we can be understood, and about the kind of language we can use to express what it means to exist as human beings. And since I understand literature as one means by which we try to understand our experience and the kinds of beings that we are, there is surely no better rationale for literary studies in general. Now, that doesn't mean that I hold outdated notions about Shakespeare as a kind of universal author who speaks deep truths about human nature. You probably know that British colonists taught Shakespeare as a great literature that could transcend differences in culture, language, traditions, and beliefs. Shakespeare was used for that reason as a tool for colonization. Now, I think it's safe to say that this view of Shakespeare as universal is completely outdated, and it's for good reasons, because while it's true that his work continues to be relevant in many ways, there are also so many things about his plays and his poems that are very specific to the culture and language that he was writing in. I mean, it's not very easy for us to read Shakespeare and just understand everything about it, and that's enough to show us about Shakespeare's lack of universality, in fact. And it's precisely for that reason that untranslatability is so interesting, because it reveals what's not universal, but also it reveals what's foundational to Shakespeare's sense of the world. Today, I'm going to look at what's probably the most famous translational crux in Japanese translations of Shakespeare. And that's the first line of Hamlet's fourth soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. For those of you who've studied anything about Shakespeare in Japan, some of my lecture will be familiar material relating to the untranslatability of this line. What will be new and hopefully interesting to you is the philosophical questions raised by this untranslatability and what it might say about Shakespeare. My starting point is a strange cartoon drawn probably by Charles Bergman in 1874. And I'm afraid I can't show it to you, but you can find it in pretty much any work on translation in Shakespeare. If you look up Charles Bergman, Hamlet, on the internet, you'll find it immediately. And this comic is very interesting because it contains a very bizarre translation of Hamlet's fourth soliloquy in Japanese. The first line says in Western characters, arimasu, arimasen, are wa nan desu ka? It's completely ridiculous. And ironically, there's something untranslatable about why that's so ridiculous. But I suppose the closest way of saying that line in English would be something like, it is not, what is that? And the cartoon's brought up so often, you're probably sick of it by now, but it is a significant thing. And the fact that Bergman was a fluent speaker of Japanese makes this translation doubly odd. But as Masao Tanaka explains, the reason that the soliloquy is so incomprehensible is probably because it's written in a form of English-Japanese Yokohama slang that Bergman is satirizing by translating it with the aid of a dialect book. Now, the reason that I think that this comic is significant is that even though Bergman's version is probably intended as nothing more than a kind of humorous travesty of Shakespeare, it points to something crucial about Shakespeare and about Japanese translation. As you probably know, to be or not to be can't be translated adequately into Japanese because to be has no equivalent Japanese verb. In the afterword to his new translation, Hamlet, Shoichiro Kawai lists 40 known translations of the phrase, starting with Workman's cartoon and ending with his own translation. And it would be worth going through those translations in your own time if you are interested in this subject, because it's fascinating how, faced with its untranslatability, each translator emphasizes a different aspect of the phrase. So that can be poetic simplicity, philosophical cogitation, despondency, or they might focus more on rhythm, on rhyme, on a sense of the speed, thinking about its delivery for performance. But none of these translations contains the multiplicity of meanings evoked by the original. So there's no better way of exploring how to be or not to be pushes up against the limits of the Japanese language and how or what it can signify. This is why the problems posed by translating Hamlet's soliloquy into Japanese is a perfect way of thinking afresh about the profound philosophical questions that Shakespeare raises in this most famous line of verse in the English language. So let's think a little bit more about Hamlet's soliloquy in Japanese. The most obvious problematic feature of the phrase to be or not to be that confronts the Japanese translator is ambiguity. If the translator takes to be as meaning to exist, then they can choose nagaraeru, for instance, in a slightly older one, or aru, or iru. But in that situation, it's not really clear who is or what is doing the existing. If they choose variations of to do, yaru or suru, it's not clear what needs to be done. And if it's translated into phrases concerning the status quo, such as, is it fine to continue now? And there are some versions like this, that's, このままでいいのか、いけないのか, or is this fine? これで良いのか、いけないのか? It's unclear in that situation what's meant by phrases like as now, このまま, or this, これ. The same ambiguity is true of anomalous translations, such as Bunju Raguchi's Which Is It? He says, さあ、どっちだろうか? Or indeed, Workman's cartoon, it is not. In all of these cases, the referent remains quite obscure. It's not very clear what is doing the existing, what is doing the doing, what is fine to continue, all of those problems. The only translation that has a clear subject is probably the most common one, and that's to die or not to die, variations of ikiru ka, shinu ka. Because the personal pronoun is always implied in Japanese and you don't have to say I am each time, the fact that the verb has no clear pronoun doesn't really matter because it obviously points to the person who's speaking. So in those translations that take Hamlet as contemplating suicide, it's the least ambiguous way of looking at this soliloquy. So many of these translations contain or imply what are known as indexicals. They're words like it, this, that. These indexicals are at once the most particular and the most universal of words because they can refer to anything, but they always have to refer to something. They are indicators with no descriptive content. As the German philosopher Hegel points out, indexicals are significant because they rely on context for their meaning. So a sentence that contains indexicals makes sense only through its context. In the case of to be or not to be, then, a translator's choice is often going to be resting on their reading of the lines that follow. That is, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. The meaning of these lines is not obvious either, but translations such as, is this fine, gain some clarity when this is read as referring to the personal or social turmoil suggested by outrageous fortune or a sea of troubles. And if the translator interprets these lines as pointing to the internal strife of Hamlet, they may decide that the meaning of to be or not to be that matters most is to live or to die. So the choice to go for to live or to die might be dictated by the context in which that line is placed. But I think that it's worth thinking about the possibility that indeterminacy or ambiguity is actually a fundamental aspect of literary texts. As readers, our job is to embrace or to resolve those ambiguities by considering the various and sometimes even conflicting factors that affect the interpretation of the text. But a translator that's faced with uncertainty or untranslatability finds that they need to fix the meaning, because often the ambiguity of the original cannot be retained in the way it is. This is partly because if the text doesn't make sense, then the translator might be blamed for it. So there are practical focuses here. And if the translation is for performance, of course, the audience doesn't have the editorial glosses or the time that they would need to appreciate that ambiguity. And because Shakespeare's works are generally translated for performance in Japan, and often actually even commissioned by theatre directors, it's crucial for a translator to find a phrase that doesn't sound strained or incomprehensible. But it's also worth pointing out the fact that familiar as the phrase to be or not to be is for English ears, it actually has the same vagueness that haunts these Japanese translations. After all, you think about it, to be or not to be what? What exactly is the question? There's no obvious key to these indexicals that Hamlet is using. Like translators, critics always need to try and make sense of to be or not to be in relation to the lines that follow, or the full soliloquy, or the rest of the play, even though the soliloquy's relation to the rest of the play is also not really obvious. So when we look at the unnatural nature of this phrase, we think about the possibility that Shakespeare is drawing attention to the presence of that verb to be, because he uses it in such an unusual way by placing it at the end of a sentence or a phrase and omitting to follow it with a verb or an adjective or a noun. It's syntactically quite unnatural, in fact. One doesn't usually speak English and say something like, shall I be? And the Japanese terms for to exist, aru or iru, can't be used without giving some indication about what subject one is talking about either. And this is not unique to Japanese. While the rule isn't absolute, to be is rarely used without a subject in English. So bold translators like Tsubouchi Shoyo consider the fact that the English is not natural and try to use Japanese, I think, in a similarly unusual manner. And I think it's the aru that he uses, or the nagaraeru, which is, it just doesn't make sense in the context of a performance. It's very hard to understand what he's talking about, but he is trying to retain something of the strangeness of that verb. So the translation of to be or not to be as to die or not to die, while it might be the most common translation in Japanese, further emphasizes Shakespeare's unusual use of to be, because the more concrete and more obvious meaning of to die reveals something about the original, about to be, that can't be contained in the term to die, or any other word for that matter. So in this sense, to die or not to die, while achieving a kind of clarity beyond other translations, might also obscure what makes the original line so interesting. Shakespeare could have used a different verb in English as well, to live, or to be or not to be a revenger, make it clear, if he had wished to be unambiguous. So Shakespeare's choice of to be in the first line of Hamlet's speech is significant, not just because it's poetic, but because it draws attention to the use of one of the most vital verbs in the English language, and one which is often used unthinkingly by Anglophone speakers by virtue of its necessity and its ubiquity. It's almost impossible to say anything in English without using a conjugation of the verb to be. But why does Shakespeare draw attention to being? The interpretative problem posed by this distressingly hackneyed speech isn't something that only Japanese translators need to deal with. But this lecture isn't an attempt to solve the puzzle of what Shakespeare means by being in Hamlet's soliloquy. The point is to show how a translational crux can draw attention to something distinctive about Shakespeare's writing in this speech throwing its syntactical difficulty and its interpretative complexity into relief. As Akimasa Minamitami observes of to be or not to be, this is where a translator must suffer and use all his wit, but these are also the sorts of places that provide the thrill of translation. For instance, in German, where there is an equivalent verb to be, it is possible to translate it verbatim as sein oder nicht sein. But even if that is an easy approach as translation goes, it does not have the challenge that comes from really digging into the original text. It's the very syntactical differences of a language like Japanese that create the peculiarities of translation, and it is in search for the possibilities of creative translated expressions that one can have significant linguistic experiences. End quote. The translator who doesn't have the option of translating verbatim must become an interpreter of what those untranslatable words mean. In the case of to be, something significant emerges, because even though James Calderwood states that it is precisely the most abstract and universal of verbs, to be, that frets Hamlet in his most famous soliloquy, it turns out that that verb is not a universal verb. We all exist, but not all languages are centered on the fact of our existence. Looking at Hamlet from the perspective of untranslatability can help to identify the cultural conditions of the thinking in this soliloquy, whose logic is concealed from those who speak and think in a language grounded in the idea of being. But before going any further, it's worth giving some thought to some historical ideas and to the very problematic but interesting view that the inability to translate the phrase to be or not to be might actually show the poverty of the Japanese language. So to do so, I'm going to need to talk a little bit about the history of translation and about the reception of Hamlet's soliloquy in Japan. As Kawariashiza has pointed out, the missionary Reverend Joseph Edkins considered this idea that Japanese might not be a good enough language for Hamlet in his lecture, The Nature of the Japanese Language and Its Possible Improvements, which he gave at the Asiatic Society of Japan in 1872, just around the time the first adaptations of Hamlet were appearing in Japanese. From the ethnocentric premise that, in his words, the European languages are the most perfect and finished in the world, he implies that all languages naturally evolve towards a more perfect form. So Edkins took issue with what has since come to be called the head final structure of the Japanese language, where the main verb comes at the end of the sentence, as opposed to the head initial syntax of most European languages. According to Edkins, for the human mind to resign itself to the control of so inconvenient a law is a decisive proof of intellectual inferiority. It does not belong to the speech of nations with creative genius. He also says that the Japanese language and literature are both poor, the literature being a reflection of the language, since greatness in literature is impossible to those who have not been born to the use of an elevated language. And Edkins is wrong, of course, but his view that the Western languages are superior to other languages was not unique to him. It stemmed from a theory known as unilinear cultural evolution. That is unilinear cultural evolution. It's a sociological idea that was popular at the turn of the 20th century. According to this theory, different societies were at various stages of the same sequence of cultural evolution. That is, all cultures are evolving towards a sort of more perfect form, if you like. And the theorists thought that the fact that Western cultures had achieved technological advancement meant that they had progressed further than other more simple cultures. And this kind of thinking is still somewhat reflected, I think, in terms like developing nation, because the idea that there are nations that are developing posits a kind of teleological or end to development, if you like. So by saying that a nation is developing, they are essentially saying that the technologically developed Western view is the goal of all societies. But other aspects of unilinear cultural evolutions are no longer current. For instance, this idea that Edkins is speaking about, that the languages of these supposedly developed nations were also more advanced, an idea that influenced the colonial approach to language. It was from this perspective that 19th century linguists and ethnographers assumed that linguistic classifications could be used to judge evolutionary rankings of groups and societies. But I think one of the more important things about this is that it wasn't just Western people who considered themselves superior necessarily. There were also many Japanese intellectuals in the Meiji era who were reacting to the huge influx of Western culture that followed the forced opening of the country in 1854, that felt that their own language, culture, and literature were inferior to the foreign works to which they were suddenly exposed. And the result was a turn to translation on an absolutely unprecedented scale, ranging from technical guides to medicine, to philosophy, to literature, to all things that they could get their hands on pretty much, with the aim of incorporating, transforming, and in some cases, replacing Japanese traditions and art forms. In fact, many Japanese translators in the late 19th century attempted what is called foreignizing translations that retained foreign words. And this was in the hope that they would be incorporated into Japanese and that they would enrich the native tongue. I suppose this has succeeded to some extent because there are quite a lot of so-called gairaigo, katakana words in Japanese that are used in place of Japanese words, or to replace or to incorporate concepts that don't traditionally exist in Japanese. And some translators were actually quite extreme in this. There was one person, for instance, called Iwano Home, who went so far as to keep the syntax and the punctuation of the foreign languages he was translating from, ignoring Japanese word order on the grounds that a new syntax was necessary for grasping new ways of thinking. I can't imagine that this would make any sense, though, the kind of translation he was producing. So the early translations of Shakespeare were part of this move to import Western thought and methods. And Tsubochi Shoyo, for instance, claims that he was interested in Shakespeare not as a Western classic, but mainly, in his words, as a diamond from another mountain for the innovation of our theatre. So the objective was innovation and changing or improving existing culture. Shakespeare had an impact outside of the theatrical circles too, because Hamlet's fourth soliloquy was heralded as a kind of vehicle through which new poetic styles could be developed and established in Japan, independent of the play. There were 3 different translations that appeared quite early on in an anthology aptly named Shintai Shisho. In other words, many Japanese thinkers of the time believed that their own language and art forms lacked the ability to express new and Western ideas, and they were looking for various ways of changing what they had. So Reverend Edkins's argument that the Japanese language needed to change was in keeping with some Japanese intellectuals' feeling of linguistic inferiority. The crucial difference, though, between Japanese thinkers and Edkins was his belief that the Japanese needed external help to improve their language. This was, of course, a way of thinking shared by many colonists whose classification of some languages as more developed than others fueled the desire to improve indigenous languages or to teach a better language in many parts of the world. And this is something that many linguistic historians point out about, for instance, the colonization of Africa, where functional and formal inadequacy, supposedly, of the indigenous languages and therefore of the indigenous mind or civilization was often alleged to justify European tutelage. The capacity to express things in particular ways wasn't seen simply as a question of difference, but actually an ideological matter, and even as a question of moral and intellectual superiority. So Edkins's misguided conviction that foreign educators should help the Japanese to improve their own language prompted even some linguistic historians such as Roy Andrew Miller to quip that perhaps in his missionary zeal, Edkins had confused syntax and sin. But notwithstanding this indefensible sense of superiority that Edkins's lecture exudes, there is something quite perceptive to be retrieved from his fixation on language syntax and the kind of expression that it allows. So for a Shakespearean, I think one of the more interesting or curious statements that Edkins makes is that the infusion of French modifying elements beginning from the Norman conquest and of Hebrew originated by the intense study of the Bible modified and molded English into a form that might suit the genius of Shakespeare. The choice of Shakespeare and the claims about Shakespeare's genius are definitely dictated by the opinions of the time, but there's something interesting going on in Edkins's claim here, which is that Shakespeare, regardless of the many words that he invented, was constrained by the limits of the language available to him. So it's the language that suits the genius of Shakespeare in Edkins's view. The implication is that if Shakespeare had been born in any other country, the language may not have suited him. He might not have been able to produce the kind of works he did. It seems that for Edkins, it was the language and its history that made it possible for Shakespeare to express his genius. And what matters for my lecture today is not whether the ability to express certain ideas makes one language better than another, but the fact that any language shapes what can be said by speakers of that language. Of course, the theory that language and thought are intertwined is hardly unique to Edkins. It's a common topic in philosophy and in linguistics, where the theory is referred to as linguistic relativity. And this theory has even been the premise of some films like the science fiction film Arrival, which was shown in Japan under the title Message. The idea is expressed by one of its early advocates, Edward Sapir, as follows. He says that human beings are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication or reflection. The fact of the matter is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. So to put it more simply, Sapir is pointing out that there's a close connection between the way one understands the world and the language that one speaks. And this isn't the same as another theory called linguistic determinism, which is the demonstrably false idea that language entirely controls your thought. Linguistic relativity is only claiming that language influences what can be thought, making certain ways of thinking more habitual than others. As Michael Agar puts it, language carries with it patterns of seeing, knowing, talking, and acting, not patterns that imprison you, but patterns that mark easier trails for thought and perception and action. And I'll give you a very simple example. That would be something like the Japanese word ki. There are many words such as genki, byoki, kibun, as well as phrases like ki ga kiku or ki ga nukeru, which all rely on an implicit thinking or understanding of this term ki as a concept in Japanese. But it's a concept that has no equivalence in English. And while it's possible to explain what it means and what kind of idea it describes, unless an Anglophone speaker learns Japanese in quite a serious way and learns a lot more about Japanese history and society, it's not easy for him or her to think using this established linguistic pattern. They're just sounds, not concepts, to a foreign speaker. And the same, I think, is true for a Japanese person and the verb to be. There's nothing that encompasses what that word means, so it's not a culturally established way of thinking. So when we think about to be or not to be, we need to be aware that it's the existence of this verb to be and its centrality to the English language that makes it possible for Shakespeare to depict Hamlet's concern for his own life, as well as existence more generally in this condensed form. Looking at untranslatables can thus show the ways thought that might be structured in a particular language. What might untranslatability reveal about Hamlet's soliloquy? I think there's no better way of explaining or exploring a concept like to be than through philosophy, especially since the connection between language and thought is a key philosophical idea. So let's turn to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein claims that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So that's a similar kind of idea to what Sapir is saying. Language restricts what can be said, and the structure of a language governs to a large extent what one can express, discuss, and even think in that language. But far from proving the inferiority of languages that are unable to express the same thing as European languages can, Wittgenstein critiques the way that European languages might allow someone to say too much or say things that shouldn't be said. His argument is that some languages have the capacity to allow meaningless sentences to appear as if they have meaning. In the big typescript, he comments that our language has remained constant and keeps seducing us into thinking the same questions. So long as there is a verb be that seems to function like eat and drink, humans will continue to bump up against the same mysterious difficulties and stare at something that no explanation seems able to remove. I'm not forgetting the fact, by the way, that Hamlet is a work of dramatic fiction rather than philosophy, but insofar as to be or not to be contains philosophical sentiments and unusual syntax, it's worth discussing in this light. The problem with a phrase like to be or not to be for Wittgenstein is that it uses the verb be like eat or drink, as if it's an action that we can explain. But his point is that in divorcing to be from a subject, the line goes against the structure of the English language. Wittgenstein says that the reasons why these problems of philosophy are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood. In other words, what seems enigmatic may just be a problem of phrasing rather than meaning. In the case of my example, it may not be that Japanese can't express enough, but that English and many other European languages appear to be saying something when they're not. Wittgenstein concludes his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with what can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. At least as regards philosophy, he thought that some things couldn't be discussed in any meaningful way. And a group of philosophers known as the Logical Positivists took Wittgenstein's ideas to an extreme and even argued that the metaphysical use of terms such as existence or being are kind of nonsense or meaningless, philosophically speaking. It's because when used badly, such words have no provable empirical significance. They try to use language for something that's inexpressible, and they phrase things in a way that goes against the logical structure of language. So if a problem is caused by linguistic ambiguity, then it's nonsense for these logical positivists. They're just not worth philosophical discussion. They say that there's nothing deep going on, only ambiguous and illogical writing. So this implies a kind of narrowed sense of what counts as meaningful, where meaning refers to anything that has a concretely explicable sense or an empirically provable, real sense of something that can be touched. Something like table has more meaning than being for them. So anything beyond that, including art and religion, can't be expressed meaningfully, at least in philosophical terms. They're not saying that it's meaningless in a kind of pejorative way. They mean that it's meaningless in a logical sense. So from the perspective of logical positivism, to be or not to be is nonsense. It's a kind of pseudo-statement like the phrase, Caesar is and. That's not really a phrase. It doesn't make sense because it's counter-syntactical. Proper English syntax requires to be followed by a noun, a verb, or an adjective, and the beginning of Hamlet's soliloquy breaks this logical rule. And one of the logical positivists, whose name is Rudolf Carnap, puts this in quite a useful way, so I'll just read out quite a long quotation. He says that perhaps the majority of the logical mistakes that are committed when pseudo-statements are made are based on the logical faults infecting the use of the word to be in our language. The first fault is the ambiguity of the word to be. It is sometimes used as a copula fixed to a predicate, as in I am hungry, sometimes to designate existence, just I am. This mistake is aggravated by the fact that metaphysicians are often not clear about this ambiguity. The second fault lies in the form of the verb in its second meaning, the meaning of existence. The verbal form feigns a predicate where there is none. The sign for existence is such that it cannot, like a predicate, be applied to signs for objects, but only to predicates. So most metaphysicians since antiquities have allowed themselves to be seduced into pseudo-statements by the verbal and the predicative verb form of the word to be, as in I am or God is. So he's saying that there's a mix-up going on here, that it's fine to use to be as in to be hungry, to be Japanese, to be here, but it's not okay to just say to be or God is or you are without following it with something that verb is pointing to. Because to be or not to be is logically and syntactically incomplete, it's a philosophically meaningless phrase, an attempt to say something unsayable. So from the perspective of logical positivism, it's not so much that Hamlet is posing a deep existential question, but that he is misusing language. Like many metaphysicians, Hamlet might be misusing to be. And if we take Wittgenstein's so-called therapeutic philosophy seriously, then the effect is much like Kuniyoshi Munakata's Buddhist version of the fourth soliloquy, which I quite like. To be or not to be is no longer the question. This rephrasing of Hamlet's famous words is just as applicable to the way that this kind of philosophy dissolves metaphysical questions as it is to Buddhist detachment and enlightenment. And this is an interesting point, but of course, Wittgenstein's project was mainly to draw a limit to thought or to the expression of thoughts, and so to set out the boundaries of just philosophical thinking. For him, as for Carnap, art is a completely different category because its purpose is not to make claims about the truth of the world. Still, these ideas about the use of metaphysical language shed light on translation. Far from the English language being superior, as Edkins claimed, by virtue of its capacity to express complex ideas, this kind of philosophy suggests that the grammatical structure of English and other European languages might in fact allow for a misuse of language to masquerade as a profound question about human existence. As I've been suggesting, it's possible that to be or not to be is not untranslatable because of a deficiency in the Japanese language, but because it's grammatically nonsensical. And the point is also not to disparage the significance of Hamlet's soliloquy, which I actually do think contains some profound philosophical ideas. But such discussions about language are meaningful in combination with questions about translatability, because they can expose cultural conditions required even to express thoughts about existence in a certain way. So if the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, then to be is not simply untranslatable, but also on some level unthinkable in Japanese. Is it the case then that Shakespeare can't be translated adequately into Japanese, not just linguistically, but conceptually? I'm going to continue looking at some early responses to Shakespeare, partly because I think that there is a clearer sense of the difference between Japan and the West in the people who first encountered the influx of Western ideas and language. Now, Natsume Soseki, the great scholar and the great doubter of English literature, certainly did not think that Shakespeare could be translated into Japanese. Although he expressed respect for Tsubo Chiyo's efforts at the first performance of a full translation of Hamlet in Japan in 1911, Soseki argued that works written in England 300 years earlier in blank verse were incompatible with existing Japanese expressions and poetic forms. For Soseki, there is an unbridgeable gap between the play and the audience. And he thinks that Tsuboichi's faithfulness to Shakespeare is unfaithful to a Japanese audience because his version doesn't use any of the words that Japanese people require psychologically and out of custom, and it becomes forced Japanese to fit Shakespeare's wording. In fact, Soseki goes as far as to declare that the fundamental nature of Shakespeare's plays does not allow a Japanese translation. And any attempt is a kind of abandonment of the Japanese people. I think that this sounds quite nationalistic, but it's also an implicit critique of the attempt to copy and integrate Western arts and Western tastes to so improve Japanese culture. Because that kind of criticism voices a serious concern about identity in a rapidly changing country, and a kind of clear-eyed concern about Westernization. Soseki warns against thinking Japanese tastes inferior and accepting the view that Shakespeare's works hold the mirror up to nature. He points out that while Shakespeare depicts some things realistically, there are also extremely unnatural phrases in the plays which he finds hard to believe would have been colloquial for any person, anywhere, even in the early modern period, because this language that he's using is not being used as a tool for communication. I think to be or not to be is one of those moments. It's definitely not being used as a tool for communication. So Soseki touches here on something at the heart of the problem of translation, the fact that untranslatability is a symptom of an immense cultural gap reinforced by the structures of language, of the kinds of thought that are facilitated by language. Translation and what can be said in certain languages evidently concerned Natsume, who channeled his uneasiness in his novel Sanshiro, in which the protagonist goes to see a production of Hamlet in Japanese. And this is a kind of thinly disguised biography, I think, here, because Sanshiro, while impressed by the movement in this Western drama, so different from no drama, is unsure about the language. And the narrator describes Sanshiro's reaction as follows. The dialogue was in Japanese, translated Japanese, Japanese spoken with exaggerated intonations, unusual rhythms. It poured forth so fluently at times it seemed almost too eloquent. It was a fine literary style, but it was not moving. Sanshiro wished that Hamlet would say something a little more characteristically Japanese. So for Sanshiro, this Japanese is quite unsettling. The form of the language is odd. It's not easy to understand, even though there's nothing technically wrong with it. But it's also this content, the literary quality, the over-eloquent expressions, and the fact that Hamlet doesn't phrase things in idiomatic Japanese. Hamlet voices ideas at odds with the sort of thinking and speaking that the language accommodates on a structural level. Alongside the socio-historical circumstances of Soseki's critique lies a concern with what's expressible in a particular language and the historical or cultural nature of what may appear to be universal. And he says, appealing to my own experience, the realm of poetry created by Shakespeare does not possess that universality that European critics agree it has. For us to appreciate Shakespeare the same way is the result of years of training, and then only dimly through a deliberate adaptation of our sensibilities. Translation is not enough, in other words, for understanding another culture. Literary works actually require one to adapt one's own sensibilities to a way of thinking that one's native language does not have. Wittgenstein's idea that what can be said depends on one's language holds true, because learning a new language is a kind of way of learning to think differently. But if language is the basis of metaphysical speculation, the fact that Japanese has no word for what being expresses in English suggests that there is no way of thinking about this concept in quite the same way. This is partly because being, unlike many word-level untranslatables, is not a word whose meaning can be approximated for something or for which a new word can be coined. So just using a katakana term is not going to capture what this word means. It's not a concept, you see, but a vehicle for expression, as well as a concept, that's fundamental to English in a way that it can never be for Japanese. I think it's telling that those first three translators of Hamlet's fourth soliloquy in 1882 felt that a new poetry was required to render the sentiments of Hamlet's speech into Japanese, because it shows that meaning isn't simply a question of ideas, but of form as well. If language is what delimits the world of the speakers of that language, Japanese people in the Meiji period may not have lacked the capacity to understand things, but they might have lacked the linguistic means of engaging with Western philosophical drama and notions. The introduction of a foreign language also entails the introduction of a new way of thinking. And even if Japanese can't change so fundamentally that being could become central to its grammar, those who studied in another language gained access to a means of thinking in different ways. I think one of the reasons that Hamlet may have appealed to early translators of Shakespeare was precisely for its depiction of something alien to traditional Japanese culture. As it has been argued before, Western literature, and particularly Shakespeare, had a profound effect on young Japanese minds at the turn of the 19th century. As Yasunari Takahashi has argued, without the plays having actually been performed yet, Prince Hamlet became for the young literati what he had become for European romantics a century before, a modern self, doubting everything, but true to its own doubting conscience, fiercely critical of the established order, lonely and vulnerable. I think it's true that the Japanese were introspective in their own kind of way prior to Western influences, but the kind of modern self represented by Hamlet was, as many recognized at the time, something quite new. It was the awakening of a new kind of self-awareness. I think that this is best illustrated by the famous suicide of Misao Fujimura, a 17-year-old student of English literature. In 1903, Fujimura, who happened to be one of Soseki's pupils, threw himself into the Kegon Falls, leaving a suicide poem carved into a tree trunk nearby. And I think you might know this. He titled it Thoughts on the Precipice, and he wrote, "How immense the universe, how eternal history. I wanted to measure immensity with this small body. What authority has Horatio's philosophy? The truth of all creation is captured in a word that is unfathomable. Troubled with this regret, I finally determined to die. As I stand atop the precipice, I have no anxiety in my heart. I know for the first time, great pessimism is equivalent to great optimism." What's most striking here is the metaphysical nature of Fujimura's desire to understand the entire universe, and his mention of Horatio's philosophy. I'll come back to that. But he separates essentially his consciousness from the universe that he's measuring himself against. And this kind of contemplation is quite unfamiliar to traditional Japanese thought. I don't have time here to discuss Japanese thought in any great detail, but it's safe to say that social thinking was determined largely by a set of traditions such as Confucianism, which embeds the self within social relations, Shinto belief, which is about the self within nature, and Buddhism, which considers the self or the ego as an obstacle to enlightenment. So in all these cases, all three schools of thought shows that there's no kind of subject-object split in the traditional understanding of self and world in Japanese thought. In fact, it's almost a contradiction to say self and world, because self is world and self is part of the world. And as Takahashi notes, Fujimura's suicide was construed at that time as symptomatic of the anxiety over the problem of self, which had been accruing in the Japanese psyche. The change in social structure and a more fully developed form of capitalism made the self more important than it had been. But the crisis of individualism and the psychological disjointedness of a young generation caught between cultural identities also has a specifically literary aspect. and that's expressed by Fujimura's suicide poem in the phrase Horatio's philosophy. There's almost no doubt that Horatio's philosophy is an allusion to Hamlet, because Fujimura had been studying Hamlet at the time. It refers to the moment that Hamlet tells his friend, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And here Hamlet means natural philosophy, so that's biological sciences. And when he says your philosophy, he doesn't mean Horatio's personal philosophy, but it's a more general term, as in philosophy in general. But Fujimura evidently misunderstood the meaning of this phrase and thought that Hamlet must be discussing Horatio's personal philosophy. And Fujimura's focus is Hamlet's sense that there are things that can't be explained through science, the rational world represented by Horatio, who initially thinks that those ghost sightings are fantasy. There's something about existence, the truth of the universe itself, and the existence of a single being like himself in such a vast universe was connected for this young boy with Hamlet. To be or not to be may be untranslatable, may be inexpressible in Japanese, but Fujimura, studying in English, did grasp the metaphysical implications of this question of being, and Hamlet was his point of reference. I think I can make the claim that studying English literature in the English language appears to have made something thinkable for Fujimura. And if we're going to take him at his word, then that something was quite overwhelming. The reception of Shakespeare in Japan started with adaptation, but it soon switched from adaptation to direct translations. And within a couple of decades, as I've already mentioned, full productions of Hamlet, complete with the soliloquies, were being staged in Tokyo. Despite Soseki's sense of the unnaturalness of Japanese translations of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's plays were being translated, and they did come to be accepted and even sometimes popular in Japan. It may not be natural to Japanese sensibilities for the characters to express themselves the way they do, but there is sufficient understanding of Western ways of thoughts for it not to be completely alien. As Mark Williams and David Rycroft point out, it is the dominant poetics of the day in the receiving culture that will determine the strategy of translation to be adopted. The self-image at the time of translation, the types of text it deems acceptable, the levels of acceptable diction, the configurations of the prospective audience, and the cultural scripts to which that audience is accustomed and which it is willing to accept. Early Meiji audiences required Western texts to be domesticated and mediated through familiar conventions. The acceptable diction of Japanese theater was dictated, for instance, by kabuki and shaped audiences' expectations. But what it meant to sound Japanese changed as the Japanese language changed. By the time Tsuboichi Shoyo finished translating the complete works of Shakespeare, the westernization of Japan had reached a stage at which a more accurate, precise introduction of European culture and civilization was possible, as well as desirable. The period when eclectic adaptation was needed to mitigate that shock of the encounter with the foreign was over. So where earlier adapters changed the works to suit the taste of the audience, later translators assisted in changing the tastes of the audience in order to suit the work. The shift in the expectations of audiences was not just a result of changing theatrical fashions, but a question of language. As you know, there's almost as much difference between early 19th century Japanese and modern Japanese as there is between modern English and early modern English. But then Japanese tastes and language changed, partly because of the introduction of Western literature, and it made Western literature and drama more palatable. In fact, I think the westernization of Japanese taste was so successful that Shakespeare translated into modern Japanese is easier to understand for most modern Japanese people than kabuki is today. So a kabuki version of Shakespeare, however interesting, no longer makes Shakespeare more Japanese, because that form of Japaneseness is no longer current. I think it's possible to say that this kind of change happens because of the history of Shakespeare reception. It may be that Japanese practitioners now engage with Shakespeare in a different kind of way because their language and ideas have been shaped by the very Western texts they now seek to transcend, perhaps, than to imitate. Hamlet's tormented inner reflections aren't necessarily natural to Japanese thinking, but neither is it any longer alien and incomprehensible in the way that Soseki was talking about. So let me bring these thoughts to some kind of conclusion. Despite the radical transformations the Japanese language and Japanese culture have undergone, the untranslatability of to be remains. There can be no doubt that foreign languages and new kinds of thinking they made possible changed Japan to the extent that modern Japanese has created ways of talking about concepts that previously did not exist for those who spoke and wrote Japanese. But there are parts of a linguistic system that can't be changed simply by importing or inventing new words. And as I've already said, to be will never be a fundamental part of the Japanese language. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, I'm interested in making the study of translation bi-directional. Untranslatability has certainly shed a lot of light on modern Japanese history and changes in thought, but what can it reveal about Shakespeare? The crucial grammatical fact that to be does not exist in another language might reveal deep-seated Western assumptions about what counts as a questioning of the world, and therefore what makes a literary work intellectually significant. It's no exaggeration to claim that the essential task of Western philosophy has been and remains the search for the truth of what things are, for the nature of their being and how beings ought to act. For most of Western philosophy, as for Hamlet, the focus is on the nature of being. So perhaps the reason why Hamlet's soliloquy is so often considered a form of philosophical deliberation, rather than just a meditation on suicide, is that it touches the core of Western philosophical thinking. But untranslatability reveals that such a focus is historically and culturally contingent. It's always partly a question of language and grammar rather than objective truth. Aside from formal abstract knowledge like mathematics, which does not rely on historical circumstance, the foundation of knowledge is itself contingent on historical circumstances and developments. So the untranslatability of Hamlet's to be or not to be points to the fact that being, as the central object of philosophical consideration, is completely contingent on historical thought. It highlights an assumption that is fundamental to English, even if one is not aware of it. So untranslatability shows the ways that Shakespeare depended on the forms of expression and thinking available to him in his language in order to be able to write Hamlet's soliloquy at all. And that's my fundamental point. His writing, like Western philosophy, is reliant on the many meanings of the verb to be, which is so central to English. But if there is any way of transcending language, using language, it's poetry. Shakespeare might be working within the metaphysical assumption that to be is the fundamental philosophical question for humans, but through repetition and syntax, he actually draws attention to his own culture's reliance on a being-centered form of thinking. It seems no accident that this opening line of Hamlet's most famous soliloquy has gained a life of its own, and that it seems to capture something fundamental about thinking, at least in the philosophical Western tradition. Thank you for listening.
So, thank you very much for that very exciting and thought-provoking lecture. You managed to give us a sweeping yet very detailed explanation of Hamlet and Shakespeare in Japan, as well as challenge the hegemony of source text and translation, which is something I'm very much interested in myself. But we have maybe about 20 minutes for questions and Q&A session. Those of you who are joining through Skype, not Skype, Zoom, I'm sorry, you're very welcome to ask questions as well. If you can put up your questions as a chat, then Mr. Shinohara will let us know, and then we can answer the questions. And those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Well, I have a lot of things I'd like to talk about. One thing, you talked about Wittgenstein, and then about, I was thinking, when Shakespeare was introduced to Japan in the beginning, my understanding is that Charles Lamb played a very big role in making Shakespeare such a big presence in Japan. And Lamb, as everyone knows, wrote a children's prose version of Shakespeare. And it's connected a little bit to what you were saying at the very end. But I was wondering whether within the same language, you could have this idea of untranslatability as well, between prose and poetry, and whether that could point the reader's attention to some of the issues that we don't necessarily think about just reading Shakespeare as verse.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think that when you have a prose version of Shakespeare, you are naturally translating. Of course, the word's normally adaptation, but adaptation is a kind of translation. And it's because your target audience is different, isn't it? I'm not sure whether you could look at Lamb and figure out the philosophical issues that it misses, though, in quite the same way that you can if you look at a translation of Japanese. And I think that's partly because they're working in the same language as Shakespeare. So it's true that there's a lot that it misses, because if you have a poetic piece, then it naturally refers to a lot more. It's a lot more context driven. It has a lot more multiplicity of meaning, whereas prose doesn't. But I think that it's accepted as something quite different. Whereas translation is regarded as, in some ways, a direct reflection. It's not really an adaptation, unless you are adapting it and making a kind of transliteration, as it were. A lot of people will be reading translation as an almost transparent way of accessing a Western text, I think. Whereas if you're going to be reading Lamb's tales from Shakespeare, then you're not thinking that you're actually getting the text, you're thinking you're getting a different mediated version. And it's something that a very famous translation critic called Lawrence Venuti has pointed out in a book aptly named The Translator's Invisibility, that there is something about translation which is taken to be a completely a transparent process, as if there is no decision going on by the translator, as if you are actually getting the essence of the text. And I think that it's there in the distinction between the fact that you have this text that's supposedly the original, and the fact that you can compare it to the original and see something that doesn't quite match, that makes it such a rich area for philosophical discussion.
It's very interesting. Sorry, just to continue on this point a little bit more, because that's something that I'm interested in. I have some of my students here who are studying Shakespeare in film. And I think film is also another medium in which you can have the actual verse, but then you can have the verse rewritten into contemporary language. And so I was just thinking also that, I think maybe you mentioned this a little bit, but when Shakespeare was translated in Japan, in the beginning, it was translated to be performed. And then it wasn't necessarily so successful. And then, so you had the kabuki versions, and then you had the Tsubochi's more faithful version. And then he stopped being performed for a while because Shingeki started and it became very unpopular. And it became something to be studied. And then you have the more modern translations, which are translations to be performed. And so I was wondering whether that kind of change in medium could influence the way that we approach the text as well. and could influence the way that we focus on particular things in the text. And so that was why I thought maybe prose versions or children's versions might sort of focus on particular things that we wouldn't necessarily focus on when we're reading the text in its original form.
Yes, I think that's right. So that's quite a dense question. I'm going to have to go through it little by little, I think. But I think the early versions of Shakespeare were adaptations for kabuki, but they were never performed, if I'm right, or at least some of them.
There was the Yamagishi Kayo's Kawakami Otojiro's version.
Yes, that's right. But Hamlet wasn't performed, I think, in the kabuki version. So some of the earlier versions were not very popular. And they were for newspaper serialization. They were written as if they were kabuki scripts. But I think that those they're more adapting to the audience taste. And I think that might be true of a lot of adaptation, actually, that it's about adapting to audience tastes rather than in order for the audience to read the original through it. And that's what I mean by this kind of one directionality of translation adaptation. It tends to be that becomes the way of reading, or that becomes an end in itself, studying it. I think that it's possible that you could read, and I think I've tried doing this a little bit. So I did a study of Kurosawa's Ran, for instance, and I was trying through that to read Shakespeare and to see what it reveals about Shakespeare, because that's always my interest, I think, is to sort of take everything back and to look in that kind of way. But it's not often done, that kind of reading Shakespeare through adaptation in that particular manner. Maybe because it's quite difficult to try and find what it is an adaptation says, because I'm not sure that adaptations are always trying to comment on it. This area gets a lot more focus in post-colonial studies, where those texts are often talked about as talking back. And there are some really great adaptations that are specifically post-colonial in that sort of way, where Shakespeare becomes, because he was the text that was taught in order to spread British colonialism. In the colonies, they use Shakespeare to sort of talk back to the colonies, and Shakespeare becomes a symbol of something they are using against the colonists, or a symbol of the colonists themselves. I think, though, in Japanese adaptation, because it wasn't technically a colonial kind of country, it's different and it's more subtle. I certainly think that there's a lot to be gained from looking at Shakespeare adaptation, especially because in staging as well as in film, you have a lot more of availability of space. And if you're just reading the text, you don't really get that sort of space. And I think that because especially Japanese and many other Asian cultures are more about negative space than they are about the words that fill that space. That's one of the reasons why Hamlet is so hard to accept for Japanese culture. He talks too much. He really does. And I think that it's not just Hamlet. A lot of Shakespeare's characters talk too much for Japanese people. And that's what remains alien about that text, that, you know, you'd never get a Japanese person just sort of talking to themselves. Oh, shall I do this? Shall I do? It's a bit annoying, I think, possibly. But when you adapt something, you might be able to get the essence of what is happening in the text and make it more Japanese in a way that's more understandable to that kind of Asian aesthetic sensibility. And I think that's in silence, that actually you can express more about presence and about being by not saying anything and just by being there. And that, I think, might be the way that you could read adaptation as a mediation on different aesthetic sensibilities. So there's quite a lot of possibility for philosophical thinking.
Thank you. Sorry, I have more questions, but does anyone in the audience have would you like me to read, or?
We have received 3 messages.
Oh,
okay.
Nice.
Would you like me to read the message? Okay. I'm just a bit shy. Okay, sorry. So the first question is, Lamb's translation was retranslated into English textbooks in the Meiji and Taisho period. Is it possible to consider such textbook as an introduction to introducing the idea of the modern West to students in Japan? And this is from Professor Matsuyama at Komazawa Women's University?
I think, yes, you can definitely see those as more textbook ways of introducing Western drama and narrative styles to Japan. And I certainly think that Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare was one of those ways that Western texts were being introduced in that great period of mass translation. Whether or not it can actually introduce the deeper problems of Westernization, I haven't made up my mind about, because I think that ultimately without poetry, you don't have those moments of serious untranslatability, because narrative, you can almost always add explanations. And this is something that I've talked to, for instance, Kawai Shoichiro about, that there is something about translating drama, and I think especially poetic drama like Shakespeare, that makes it a more problematic area of introduction. So in that sense, I think, yes, while Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare can be an introduction to Western ideas, it's not going to be one of those things that will present the serious clash between West and East, as it were. Thank you for your question.
So Matsuyama, if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to on chat. And the next question.
Thank you very much. I think I basically understand. And also, when it comes to novels, it doesn't have the limit compared to plays and poetry when it's performed. So yes, thank you very much for your answer. I think it satisfied my question.
Thank you very much.
The next question is from Paris Hemphill, and it reads, Dr. Chiba, thank you for the wonderful lecture. You mentioned earlier that some translations of To Be or Not to Be choose for an unnatural Japanese translation, realizing that the English is also unnatural. However, you also mentioned that if the translation doesn't ultimately make sense, the translator might be blamed for it. Is there a risk in translation? And could this risk hinder a chance for new or different perspectives?
That's really good, actually. That's a really good point. And I think yes is my immediate answer. I think that as long as Japanese translations are being produced for performance, it does contain risk, and most translators are not going to be willing to risk translating unnaturally. I think that almost all modern translators and all the translators that I've talked to so far have been interested in making it performable. And I think that that's a fair point as well. It's a fair choice to make, because the rationale for doing so is that Shakespeare is drama. It is there to be performed. And unless you're doing textual studies like I am, it's not going to be a major problem. And perhaps there's also the argument that if you wanted to study the text seriously, you just have to learn English and study it that way. So there is that. But I sort of wish also that some more risky translation could happen. I think it would be a really interesting and exciting way of looking at the text. And it's really telling that if you have a look at Professor Kawai's list of the translations that have been published so far, a lot of the more modern translations produced in the last 50 years tend to favor To Die or Not to Die. It becomes simpler and simpler as translation goes on, and as it becomes more focused on performance.
So thank you, Paris Hemphill. And if you have any follow-up questions, you're very welcome to post them. The next question is from Rieko Ishibuchi, and reads, thank you so much for your thought-provoking lecture. In terms of untranslatability, do you have any thoughts on the relation between gender and Japanese translation? And Ms. Ishibuchi is from the Tsubochi Memorial Theater Museum.
Oh, well, you're very close by. Yes, actually, I've been working on a new, this is an early or a lecture version of the first chapter of my current book project, Shakespeare's Untranslatability. And I'm currently working on a chapter on pronouns, and gender naturally comes into it. I think that there is untranslatability in Shakespeare because of the lack of gender, actually. And I suppose that anyone who's thought about Shakespeare in translation in Japanese has thought about this as well, because however much you try and avoid gendered language, it's ingrained in Japanese language, and it was more ingrained in earlier translations where there was a desire to use the kind of feminine endings, for instance, for female characters. I think that sort of thing has started to be deliberately taken out of translations to make it as gender neutral as possible. And yet there are certain expressions that can only be used by men, or which feel a little bit odd used by women. I went to see the all-female Julius Caesar at Parco in Shibuya the other day, and I thought it was really actually quite an interesting and exciting thing to see Japanese women using male pronouns. And that in itself was a really useful theatrical experiment. But when it comes to translation, I think there are certain things that do happen that mean that Japanese sensibilities will change the text regardless of whether the translator intends to do so or not. And that can be gendered, or it can just be, I think it can be an even deeper philosophical question about the expression of subjectivity implied by the different kinds of I's there are. So if you say watashi or ore or boku, all of those sorts of things, it has particular social implications. So I think, yes, there are gendered and all sorts of issues going on with untranslatability, which I'm hoping to work on in the future.
Thank you so much.
So the final question we have here is from Professor Honda from Meiji Gakuin University. It reads, thank you very much for your thought-provoking lecture. What do you think about difficulty in translating word plays or jokes? For example, Odashima tries to invent his own jokes when translating puns.
Yeah, I think that this might be a question again of performance, isn't it? That you want your audience to enjoy the performance, and you want to make it clear that Shakespeare does have a lot of wordplay going on. And I respect it a lot, actually, when people translate puns. In fact, I love translating puns myself. So that's one of those things that is the power of the translator, if you like. But those are moments of untranslatability because puns rely on lateral connection of homophonic connection to other words and that kind of thing. So but I'm not sure whether that's the sort of thing that will necessarily provoke philosophical discussion. It depends really on what that pun is. I'll have to think a little bit more about that, but thank you very much for your interesting question.
Thank you very much.
So we have maybe about 1 or 2 more minutes if anyone in the audience has a question. Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture. I just want to ask a question about the early part of your lecture on the when you were describing the content, you called it a travesty. I'm like, I guess it does sound ridiculous, but at the same time, from what I understood, the conclusion of your lecture was that like the concept of to be does not fundamentally exist in Japanese thinking, but still, by calling it a travesty, are you implying that there is the thing Shakespeare that must be preserved? Like there's certain sanctity in the original that does not be prose. And where would you draw the line between like damaging the original and being a legend translation instead of a joke?
Oh, I think I didn't call it a travesty. I was using travesty as a verb. To travesty something is to mock or to make fun of. And because the cartoon appears in the Japan Punch, and I think Masao Tanaka is probably right about the fact that it's meant to be a travestying of the kind of language that was being recommended for foreigners living in Yokohama. So there was a simplified form of Japanese that was being taught to Yokohama residents at the time, which I think Bergman, as a fluent speaker of Japanese, is satirizing by saying, look what happens if you try and make Shakespeare, if you try and use Shakespeare and translate it through this ridiculous phrase book. So that was the reason that I called it a travesty. But your point still stands, doesn't it? That there is the question of whether there's any sanctity to the original. I don't think there is a sanctity to the original. I don't think that you can think that and respect that there are interesting adaptations, or that translation can be a useful way of looking at the text. But I think that there are certain things that become possible thanks to untranslatability. So in fact, I might even go as far as to say that it's great that the original is not unchangeable, that there is something about it that can be questioned. And even the idea, looking through Wittgenstein, that there is a possibility that the original could be ridiculous and might not be something that we should be taking seriously, is something that I was raising. Does that answer your question? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're just about out for time. So thank you very much for gathering today. And just a kind of a postscript, Dr. Chiba and Professor Fuyuki and Waseda, we're organizing a very big conference on translation in Shakespeare, hopefully to be held in person sometime next year. We're aiming for September, but we'll have to see how the pandemic pans out. But we will have this kind of discussion in that conference. So if you have time, please do attend the conference as well. Okay, so please give another very big hand for Dr. Chiba.